Hey, we'll pick up with chapter 9 in this recording, which is entitled Barrels Out of Bond. And this is The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. Chapter 9, Part 2, Barrels Out of Bond. For some time, Bilbo sat and thought about this water gate and wondered if it could be used for the escape of his friends. And at last, he had the desperate beginnings of a plan. The evening meal had been taken to the prisoners, and the guards were tramping away down the passages, taking the torchlight with them and leaving everything in darkness. Then Bilbo heard the king's butler bidding the chief of the guards good night. "Now come with me," he said, "and taste the new wine that has just come in. I shall be hard at work tonight, clearing the cellars of the empty wood. So let us have a drink first to help the labor." "Very good," laughed the chief of the guards. "I'll taste with you and see if it's fit for the king's table. There's a feast tonight, and it would not do to send up poor stuff." When he heard this, Bilbo was all in a flutter, for he saw that luck was with him, and he had a chance at once to try his desperate plan. He followed the two elves until they entered the small cellar and sat down at the table on which two large flagons were set. Soon they began to drink and laugh merrily. Luck of an unusual kind was with Bilbo then. He must be, it must be potent wine to make the wood elves drowsy, but this wine, it would seem, was of a heady vintage of the great gardens of Dorwenion, not meant for his soldiers or his servants, but for the king's feast only, for smaller bowls, not for the butler's great flagons. Very soon the chief guard nodded his head. Then he laid it on the table and fell asleep, and the butler went on talking and laughing to himself for a while without seeming to notice. But soon his head, too, was nodding at the table, and he fell asleep and snored beside his friend. Then in crept the hobbit. It's only fitting that I'm drinking some Earl Grey. I mean, I don't know, with cream. With cream, it's otherwise. What's the point, right? Without cream, Earl Grey with cream, just to wet my whistle a little bit. Very soon, the chief guard had no keys, but Bilbo was trotting as fast as he could along the passages toward the cells. Great Bunch seemed very heavy in his arms, and his heart was often in his mouth in spite of his ring, for he could not prevent the keys from making a very now and then loud clink and clank, which put him in a tremble. First, he unlocked Balin's door and locked it again carefully as soon as the dwarf was outside. Balin was most surprised, as you can imagine, but glad as he was to get out of the wearisome little stone room. He wanted to stop and ask questions and know that what Bilbo was going to do and all about it. "No time now," said the hobbit. "You just follow me. We must all keep together and not risk getting separated. All of us must escape or none, and this is our last chance. If this is found out, goodness knows where the king will put you next, with the chains on your hands and feet too, I expect. Don't argue. There's a good fellow." Then off he went from door to door until his following had grown to 12. None of them any too nimble, what with the dark and what with their long imprisonment. Bilbo's heart thumped every time one of them bumped into another or grunted or whispered in the dark. "Drat this dwarvish racket," he said to himself. But all went well, and they met no guards. As a matter of fact, there was a great autumn feast in the woods that night, and in the halls above, nearly all the king's folk were merrymaking. At last, after much blundering, they came to Thorin's dungeon, far down in the deep place, and fortunately not far from the cellars. "Upon my word," said Thorin, when Bilbo whispered to him to come out and join his friends, "Gandalf spoke true, as usual. A pretty fine burglar you make, it seems, when the times come. I am sure we are all forever at your service, whatever happens after this. But what comes next?" Bilbo saw that the time had come to explain his idea as far as he could, but he could not feel at all sure how the dwarves would make it or take it. His fears were quite justified, for they did not like it a bit and started grumbling loudly in spite of their danger. "We shall be bruised and battered to pieces and drowned for certain," they muttered. "We thought you had got some sensible notion when you managed to get hold of the keys. This is a mad idea." "Very well," said Bilbo, very downcast and also rather annoyed. "Come along, back to your nice cells, and I will lock you all in again, and you can sit there comfortably and think of a better plan. But I do not suppose I shall ever get hold of the keys again, even if I feel inclined to try." That was too much for them, and they calmed down. In the end, of course, they had to do just what Bilbo suggested, because it was obviously impossible for them to try and find their way in the upper halls, or to fight their way out of the gates with that that were closed to magic. And it was no good grumbling in the passageways until they were caught again. So, following the hobbit down into the lowest cellars, they crept. They passed a door through which the chief guard and the butler could be seen, still happily snoring with smiles upon their faces. The wine of Dorwinion brings deep and pleasant dreams. There would be a different expression on the face of the chief guard the next day, even though Bilbo, before he went on, stole in and kind-heartedly put the keys back on his belt. That will save him from some sort of trouble that he is obviously in for, said Mr. Baggins to himself. He wasn't a bad fellow and quite decent to the prisoners. It will puzzle them all too. They'll think we had a very strong magic to pass through all those locked doors and disappear. Disappear. We have got to get busy very quick if that is to happen. Balin was told off to watch the guard and the butler and give warning if they stirred. The rest went into the adjoining cellar with the trapdoors, and there was little time to lose. Before long, Bilbo knew some elves would, under the orders of some down and would come down to help the butler get the empty barrels through the doors into the stream. These were, in fact, already standing in rows in the middle of the floor, waiting to be pushed off. Some of them were wine barrels, and these were not much use, as they could not easily be opened at the end without a deal of noise, nor could they easily be secured again. But among them were several others, which had been used for bringing other stuffs, butter, apples, and all sorts of things to the king's palace. They soon found 13, with room enough for a dwarf in each. In fact, some were too roomy, and as they climbed into and as they climbed in, sorry, as they climbed in, the dwarves thought anxiously of the shaking and bumping they would get inside, though Bilbo did his best to find straw and other stuff to pack them in as cozily as could be managed in a short time. At last, 12 dwarves were stowed. Thorin had given a lot of trouble and turned and twisted in his tub and grumbled grumbled like a large dog in a small kennel. But Balin, who came last, made a great fuss about his air holes and said he was stifling even before the lid was on. Bilbo had done what he could to close the holes in the sides of the barrels and to fix all of the lids as safely as he could be managed. Now he was left alone again, running round, putting in finishing touches to the packing and hoping against all hope that his plan would come off. It had not been done a bit too soon. Only a minute or two after Balin's lid had been fitted on, there came the sound of voices and a flicker of lights, and a number of elves came laughing and talking into the cellars and singing snatches of a song. They had left a merry feast in one of the halls and were bent on returning as soon as they could. "Where's old Gallion the butler?" said one. "I haven't seen him at the tables tonight. He ought to be there now and show us what is to be done." "I shall be angry if the old slow coach is late," said another. "I have no wish to waste time down here while the song is up." "Ha ha!" came a cry. "There's old villain with his head on a jug. He's been having a little feast all to himself and his friend, the captain." "Shake them! Wake them!" shouted the others impatiently. Gallion was not at all pleased at being shaken or awakened, and still less at being laughed at. "You're all late," he grumbled. "Here I am waiting and waiting down here, and you fellows drink and make merry and forget your tasks. Small wonder if I fall asleep from the weariness." Small wonder, they said, when the explanation stands close at hand in a jug. "Come, give us a taste of your sleeping draught before we fall to. We need we need to wake the turnkey yonder. He has had a share by the looks of it." Then they drank once round and became mighty merry all of a sudden. And they did not quite lose their wits. "Save us, Gallion," cried some. "You began your feasting early and muddled your wits. You've stacked all the full casks here instead of the empty ones, if there is anything in weight." "Get on with the work," growled the butler. "There is nothing in the feeling of weight in an idle toss pot's arms. These are the ones to go and no others, do I say?" Very well," they answered, and rolling the barrels to the opening. On your head be it, if the king's full butter tubs and his best wine is pushed into the river for the lake men to feast on for nothing. Roll, 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 rolling down the hole. Heave ho, splash plump, down they go, down they bump. So they sang his first barrel, and then others rumbled to the dark opening and pushed over into the cold water some feet below. Some were barrels really empty, some were tubs neatly packed with a dwarf each, but down they all went, one after the other, and many a splat, many a clash and a bump, thudding on the tops of the ones below, smacking into the water, jostling against the walls of the tunnel, knocking into one another and bobbing away down the current. It was just at this moment that Bilbo suddenly discovered the weak point in his plan. Most likely you saw it some time ago and have been laughing at him, but I don't suppose you would have done half as well yourselves in his place. Of course, he was not in a barrel himself, nor was there anyone to pack him in, even if there had been a chance. It looked as if he would certainly lose his friends this time. Nearly all of them had already disappeared through the dark trapdoor, get utterly left behind and have to stay lurking as a permanent burglar in the elf caves forever. For even if he could have escaped through the upper gates at once, he had a precious small chance of ever finding the dwarves again. He did not know the way by land to the place where the barrels were collected. He wondered if what on earth would happen to them without him, for he had not had time to tell the dwarfs all that he had learned, or what he had meant to do once they were out of the wood. While all of these thoughts were passing through his mind, the elves began a merry be, the elves, being very merry, began to sing a song round the river door. Some had already gone to haul on the ropes which pulled up the portcullis at the water gate, as to let out the barrels as soon as they were all afloat below. Down the swift dark stream you go, back to lands you once did know. Leave the halls and caverns deep, leave the northern mountains deep. Where the forest wide and dim, stoop in shadow, gray and grim, float beyond the world of trees, out into the whispering breeze, past the rushes, past the reeds, past the marshes, waving weeds, through the mist that riseth white, up from mere and pool at night. Follow, follow stars that leap up the heavens, cold and steep. Turn when dawn comes over land, over rapid, over sand. South away and south away, seek the sunlight and the day. Back to pasture, back to mead, where the kine and oxen feed. Back to gardens on the hills, where the berry swells and fills, under sunlight, under day. South away and south away. Down the swift dark stream you go, back to lands you once did know. Now, the very last barrel was being rolled to the doors, and in despair, not knowing what else to do, poor little Bilbo caught hold of it, and with it pushed over the edge with it. Down into the water he fell, splashed with the cold, dark water, with the barrel was on top of him. He came up again, spluttering and clinging to the wood like a rat, but for all his efforts he could not scramble on top. Every time he tried, the barrel rolled around and ducked him under again. It was really empty and floated like a cork, still singing in the cellar above. Then suddenly the trapdoors fell with a boom and their voices faded away, and he was in the dark tunnel, floating in icy water, all alone. For you cannot count friends that are all packed up in barrels. Very soon, a gray patch came in the darkness ahead, and he heard the creak of Watergate being hauled up, and he found that he was in the midst of bobbing and bumping massive casks and tubs all pressed together to pass under the arch and get out into the open stream. He had as much as he could do. He had as much as he could do to prevent himself from being hustled and battered to bits, but the last of the jostling crowd began to break up and swing off, one by one, under the stony arch and away. Then he saw it would have been no good even if he had managed to get inside astride a barrel, for there was no room to spare, not even for a hobbit, between its top and the suddenly stooping roof where the gate was. Out they went under the overhanging branches of the trees on either bank, and Bilbo wondered what the dwarves were feeling and whether a lot of water was getting into their tubs, but some of those that bobbed along by him in the gloom seemed pretty low in the water, and he guessed that these had dwarves inside. I do hope I put the lids on tight enough, he thought, but before long he was worrying too much about himself to remember the dwarves. He managed to keep his head above the water, but he was shivering with the cold, and he wondered if he would die of it before the luck turned, and how much longer he would be able to hang on, and whether he should risk the chance of letting go and trying to swim to the bank. Luck turned all right before the long. The eddying current carried several small barrels close to the shore at one point, and there, for a while, they stuck against some hidden root, while Bilbo took the opportunity of scrambling up the side of this barrel while it was held steady against the other. Up he crawled like a drowned rat and lay on top and spread out to keep the balance as best he could. The breeze was cold, but better that than the water, and he hoped he would not be suddenly rolled off again when it started off once more. Before long, the barrels broke free again and turned and twisted off down the stream and out into the main current. Then he found it quite as difficult to stick on as he had feared. As he managed it somehow, though, it was miserably uncomfortable. Luckily, he was very light, and the barrel was a good big one and had been rather leaky, had now shipped a small amount of water. All the same, it was like trying to ride without a bridle or stirrups or round-bellied pony that was always thinking of rolling in the grass. In this way, at last, Mr. Baggins came to a place where the trees, on the other hand, grew thinner, and he could see a paler sky between them, and the dark river opened suddenly wide. There was joined to the main water of the forest river, flowing down in haste from the king's great doors. There was a dim sheet of water, no longer overshadowed, and on its sliding surface there were dancing and broken reflections of clouds and of stars, and then the hurrying water of the forest river swept all the company of casks and tubs away to the north bank, in which it had been eaten out a wide bay. This had a shingly shore under a hanging banks and was walled at the eastern end by the little jutting cape of hard rock. On the shallow shore, most of the barrels ran aground, and though a few went on to bump against the stony pier, there were people on the lookout on the banks, and they quickly pulled and pushed all the barrels together into the shallows, and when they had counted them, they roped them together and pulled them till the morning. Poor dwarfs, Bilbo was not badly off now. He slipped from his barrel and waded ashore, and then sneaked along to some huts that he could see near the water's edge. He no longer thought twice about picking up a supper uninvited if he had got the chance. He had been obliged to do it for so long, and he knew now not only too well that it was to be what it was to be really hungry, not merely politely interested in the dainties of the well-filled larder. Also, he had caught a glimpse of a fire through the trees, and that appealed to him, and he was dripping and his ragged clothes clinging to him, cold and clammy. There was no need to tell you much of his adventures that night, for now we are drawing near the end of the eastward journey and coming at last to the greatest adventure, so we must hurry on. Of course, helped by his magic ring, he got on very well at first, but he was given away in the end by his wet footsteps and the trail of drippings that had left wherever he went or sat. Also, he began to snivel, and whenever he tried to hide, he was found out by terrific explosions of his suppressed sneezes. Very soon, there was a fine commotion in the village by the riverside, but Bilbo escaped into the woods, carrying a loaf and a leather bottle of wine and a pie that did not belong to him. The rest of the night he had to pass, wet as he was and far from a fire, but the bottle helped him to do that. He actually dozed a little on some dry leaves when, though the year was getting late and the air was chilly, he woke again with a specially loud sneeze, and it was already gray morning. and there was a merry racket down at the river. They were making up raft barrels, and the raft elves would soon be steering it off down the stream to the lake town. Bilbo sneezed again, and he was no longer dripping, but he felt cold all over, and he scrambled down as fast as his stiff legs would take him, and he managed just in time to get out to the mass of cask without being noticed in the general bustle. Luckily, there was no sun at the time, and to cast an awkward shadow, and for a mercy he did not sneeze again for a good while. There was a mighty pushing of poles, and the elves that were standing in the shallow water heaved and shoved, and the barrels, now lashed together, creaked and fretted. This is a heavy load, some grumbled. They float too deep. Some of these are never empty. If they had come ashore in the daylight, we would have had a look inside, they said. No time now, cried the raftman. Shove off. Past the point of the rocks where the elves stood to fend them off with poles, and then quicker and quicker as they caught the main stream and went sailing away down towards the lake. They had escaped the dungeons of the king and were through the wood, but whether alive or dead still remains to be seen. So there ends chapter 9, and we'll proceed on to chapter 10.